Imagine a quiet, polite woman you might pass on the street every day without a second glance. A professional, reliable neighbor who always smiles. In 1985 Austin, that woman was Clara Vance. Yet, behind her unassuming facade lay a cold, calculating brutality that no one suspected until it was too late. Join me as we uncover the chilling story of the appraiser. Clear. She scrubbed the porch boards with a wire brush, washing the blood into the dry earth below, where the dust greedily swallowed it. She washed her hands, dried them on her jeans, and locked the property gate behind her. She would have to wait 2 days for a heavy rainstorm to soften the earth near Lake Travis for digging, keeping the truck locked securely in her detached garage until then. But as she drove back to Austin, the radio playing a soft country tune, Clara Vance smiled. She had found her calling. By the time the Texas bluebonnets bloomed in April of 1986, the deep woods near Lake Travis held 3 secrets. The killing of Arthur Pendleton had not been an isolated snap of sanity, it had been an awakening. Clara Vance discovered that she possessed a rare, chilling talent for compartmentalization. Monday through Friday, she was the mild-mannered property appraiser, nodding politely to her boss and typing reports on her IBM Selectric. But on the weekends, when the conditions were right, she was the judge, jury, and executioner. Her second victim came in late January. His name was Mark, a 25-year-old independent land surveyor who made the fatal mistake of laughing in Clara's face when she pointed out an error in his boundary calculations on an isolated plot in Spicewood. He had poked her in the chest with his thick index finger, calling her sweetheart in a tone dripping with venom, telling her to leave the real math to the men. Clara didn't argue. She simply waited until he turned his back to pack his heavy brass transit level into its case. A rusted steel pipe from the ruins of a nearby windmill ended his condescension. The process was smoother the second time. The green canvas tarp. The thick nylon rope. The yellow 1978 F-150. She waited for the winter sleet to soften the ground, driving out to a new spot, 2 miles north of Arthur's resting place. Before she wrapped Mark, however, she noticed the silver Zippo lighter protruding from his flannel shirt pocket. She took it. It wasn't about the monetary value, it was a physical receipt of her control. The third man was Richard, an aggressive, debt-ridden investor from Houston who lured Clara to a foreclosed ranch in March. He hoped to bribe or bully her into falsifying an appraisal to save his sinking assets. When she politely but firmly refused, he blocked the exit of the dusty barn, his eyes wide with a desperate, violent frenzy. He lunged at her, intending to strike. Clara, anticipating the violence she had seen in men's eyes since childhood, already had her grip on her trusty 5-pound tire iron. 2 swift, brutal blows to the skull. Another green tarp. Another muddy grave, this time beneath the sprawling roots of an ancient pecan tree. She took his gold Timex wristwatch, the leather strap still warm from his skin. A distinct modus operandi had taken shape. Clara selected isolated, rural properties where she had legitimate, documented reasons to be present alone. She used blunt force trauma, impersonal, requiring no ammunition, leaving no ballistic evidence behind. She cleaned the crime scenes meticulously with water from outdoor pumps and a wire brush, letting the thirsty Texas dust swallow the diluted blood. She transported the bodies in the bed of her truck, disguised under burlap sacks as farm equipment. And she only buried them after a heavy rainstorm, when the unforgiving hill country limestone and clay yielded easily to her shovel. In her modest, single-story house in South Austin, beneath a loose oak floorboard in her bedroom closet, sat a small, fireproof metal lockbox. Inside rested a silver Zippo lighter and a gold Timex watch. They were her trophies, quiet reminders that she was no longer a helpless victim in a world run by cruel men. As she sipped her sweet iced tea on the porch one Sunday evening, watching the neighborhood children ride their bicycles down the street, Clara felt a profound, terrifying sense of peace. She was invisible. She was invincible. But arrogance, like the suffocating Texas heat, has a way of creeping up on you when you least expect it. July 1986 brought a suffocating, relentless heat wave to Travis County. The air was thick and heavy, shimmering above the asphalt highways like a watery mirage. Clara's 4th appraisal of the month took her to a decaying, overgrown cabin near Lago Vista, bordering the dense, untamed stretches of the hill country. The property was a neglected mess of rusted farm equipment and dying mesquite trees, and so was its owner, 32-year-old Thomas Bannister. Thomas, a former college linebacker, was a mountain of a man. He had inherited the worthless, rocky land from his estranged uncle and was desperate for cash. When Clara handed him the official appraisal report, a devastatingly low, honest assessment of the barren soil and rotting foundation, Thomas snapped. "You're lying to me, you stupid bitch," Thomas spat, his face flushing dark red with a volatile mix of cheap daytime beer and fury. He stepped off the rotting porch, cornering her against the rusted husk of an old tractor in the overgrown yard. He was standing too close, invading her space with the same terrifying entitlement she had punished 3 times before. Clara kept her face blank. She reached into her canvas tool bag for the familiar, comforting weight of her 5-pound tire iron, her heart maintaining its icy, steady rhythm. She swung it in a swift, practiced arc. But Thomas was young, paranoid, and incredibly fast. As the iron moved through the air, he raised his thick forearm, taking the brutal blow directly on the bone. He roared in agony, but instead of falling, he lunged forward. For the very first time, Clara lost control. Thomas's massive hands clamped onto her shoulders, his weight driving her backward. They crashed into the dry, unforgiving Texas dirt, kicking up a cloud of suffocating white dust. Clara fought back with the desperate feral intensity of a cornered animal, kicking and scratching. Thomas backhanded her across the jaw, blinding her with a flash of white-hot pain. As they rolled in the dirt, his thick fingers snagged on the collar of her white blouse, tearing the fabric violently. With a sickening snap, Clara's vintage silver cameo brooch, a cherished family heirloom she wore daily to complete her conservative invisible facade, was ripped from the fabric. It tumbled unnoticed into the deep, dry weeds. Blind panic, an emotion Clara hadn't felt since she was a helpless child, finally clawed at her throat. She blindly grabbed a jagged, heavy piece of limestone from the dirt. With a guttural scream, she brought it down on Thomas's temple with every ounce of strength she possessed. He stiffened, then went completely limp, his heavy body collapsing over hers. Clara violently shoved him off, gasping for air, tasting copper and dust in her mouth. She was badly bruised, covered in dirt, and completely terrified. The icy, godlike detachment she usually felt was gone, replaced by chaotic, trembling adrenaline. She rushed through her macabre routine, but her hands shook violently. The green canvas tarp. The heavy nylon rope. The bed of the yellow truck. She didn't have time to scrub the yard with the wire brush. She didn't have time to check her clothes. She didn't even notice her silver brooch was missing. She just needed to get away from the mistake. She threw the heavy tarp into the back of her F-150, tossed the burlap feed sacks over it haphazardly, and slammed the heavy metal tailgate. A mile away, standing on a high limestone ridge overlooking the valley, a retired schoolteacher named Harold lowered his binoculars. He had been quietly tracking a rare golden-cheeked warbler in the cedar trees, but the sudden roaring engine of a truck had scared the bird away. Annoyed, he looked down into the valley. Through his magnified lenses, Harold watched a bright yellow, late-70s Ford F-150 kicking up a massive plume of white dust as it sped recklessly down the abandoned private logging road. He noted the striking color and the deeply dented rear bumper, grumbling to himself about reckless teenagers, completely unaware that he had just witnessed a monster fleeing the scene of a slaughter. September 1986. The sky above Lake Travis finally broke. The unrelenting summer heat gave way to violent torrential thunderstorms that hammered the Texas Hill Country for 3 straight days. The baked, hardened clay couldn't absorb the sudden deluge. Flash floods tore through the ravines, carving deep, jagged scars into the earth and washing away tons of heavy topsoil. On the morning of September 4th, the air was cool and smelled of crushed cedar and ozone. Sarah and David, 2 University of Texas graduate students, decided to take advantage of the break in the weather. They drove out to a remote, wooded area near the lake for a hike with their golden retriever Buster. Wandering off the marked trail, they enjoyed the eerie quiet of the damp woods, oblivious to what the rain had uncovered. Buster caught the scent first. He bolted into a thick grove of ancient live oaks, his nose glued to the muddy ground. When David finally caught up to him, the dog was digging frantically at a washed-out embankment, whining with an intense, nervous energy. "Hey buddy, leave it," David commanded, reaching for the collar. But as he looked down at the freshly disturbed red dirt, his breath caught in his throat. Protruding from the eroded clay wasn't a dead animal or a buried log. It was the distinct, rigid corner of a dark green canvas tarp, tightly bound with a thick, dirty nylon rope. And then, the wind shifted. A sweet, putrid, overwhelmingly foul odor hit David like a physical blow. He stumbled backward, covering his mouth, and yelled for Sarah to grab the dog and run back to the car. By noon, the quiet woods were swarming with Austin Police Department vehicles. Yellow crime scene tape formed a stark, unnatural perimeter through the green and brown brush. Detective Ray Miller ducked under the tape, his boots squelching in the mud. Miller was 45, a 20-year veteran of homicide with a face lined by too many late nights and too much bad coffee. He wore a rumpled gray suit and a tan Stetson hat to shield his eyes from the returning Texas sun. "What are we looking at, Stevens?" Miller asked a young, pale-faced uniform officer standing guard near the excavation site. "It's bad, Detective." Stevens swallowed hard, trying not to look at the hole. The rain washed away a good 2 feet of topsoil. Hiker's dog found it. The coroner's team is just opening the tarp now. Miller walked over to the muddy trench. Two crime scene technicians, wearing heavy rubber gloves and paper masks smeared with menthol ointment to block the stench, were carefully slicing through the nylon ropes. In 1986, forensic science wasn't magic. There was no instant DNA profiling to solve the puzzle. They relied on fingerprints, dental records, blood typing, and raw deduction. They had to be meticulous. As the heavy canvas was peeled back, Miller grimaced. Inside were the badly decomposed remains of a man. The skull showed a massive, catastrophic indentation, severe blunt force trauma. But it was the neatness of the package that sent a cold chill down Miller's spine. The rope was tied with tight, practical knots. This wasn't a bar fight gone wrong, Miller muttered, pulling a small, battered notebook from his breast pocket. The killer brought a tarp. Brought heavy rope. Drove out here, hiked into the brush, and dug a deep hole in hard clay. This is organized. Methodical. Cold. As Miller began to sketch the scene, mapping out the tire tracks that had long since washed away, a shout echoed through the trees. A deputy, 50 yards away, was pointing his flashlight at another sunken depression in the mud beneath a large sprawling pecan tree. "Detective Miller!" the deputy yelled, his voice cracking slightly. "I think we've got another one over here." Miller closed his notebook, his jaw tightening. The isolated woods of Lake Travis weren't just a dumping ground. They were a graveyard. And somewhere in Austin, a monster was walking the streets. The Austin Police Department's Homicide Division in October 1986 was a cramped, suffocating room on the second floor, permanently smelling of stale Winston cigarette smoke, burnt percolator coffee, and the sharp chemical tang of mimeograph ink. There were no sleek computer monitors on the desks, no digital databases to instantly cross-reference missing persons. There were only towering stacks of manila folders, overflowing ashtrays, and a large green chalkboard that currently held the gruesome details of a growing nightmare. Detective Ray Miller stood before the board, chalk dust coating the fingers of his right hand. Beside him was his younger partner, Detective David Harris, a sharp-eyed rookie who was methodically flipping through a thick binder of missing persons reports teletyped from across the state. The mud of Lake Travis had yielded 3 bodies during the initial excavation. "Dental records are a painfully slow science," Harris, Miller grumbled, taking a long drag from his cigarette and pointing at the 3 black and white morgue photographs pinned to the board. "But the teeth don't lie. We finally have names for our John Does." Harris nodded, reading from his notepad. Victim number 1, Arthur Pendleton. 50 years old, real estate developer from Dallas. Reported missing by his wife in September of '85. Victim number 2, Mark Evans, 25. Local independent land surveyor. His girlfriend filed a report in late January of this year. Victim number 3, Richard Howell, 42. An investor from Houston, drowning in debt, vanished in March. Miller stared at the board, his eyes narrowing as he traced imaginary lines between the 3 men. A wealthy developer from Dallas, a broke investor from Houston, and a local kid with a transit level. They ran in completely different social circles. Different cities. Different bank accounts. The killer isn't targeting a specific age or tax bracket. So what's the common denominator? Harris asked, leaning against a battered metal filing cabinet. "Dirt," Miller replied softly. He tapped the board with his chalk. Specifically, rural Travis County dirt. Pendleton was looking to bulldoze a foreclosed farm. Evans was mapping out isolated property boundaries in Spicewood. Howell was trying to flip a bankrupt ranch. They were all heading out to the middle of nowhere to look at empty land just before they dropped off the map. Our killer isn't a random drifter. The killer is someone who knew exactly where these men would be, someone who had a legitimate reason to meet them out in the brush. Real estate agents? Harris suggested. Brokers? Appraisers? Exactly, Miller said, crushing his cigarette into an overflowing glass ashtray. Someone who has the keys to the gate padlocks. Someone who knows the soil well enough to dig a 6-foot hole in the clay without hitting solid limestone. Start pulling the logs from every real estate agency in the county. I want to know who was assigned to the properties these men were visiting. Before Harris could pick up the heavy, rotary dial telephone on his desk, it rang sharply. Miller picked it up. Homicide Miller. Detective Miller? My name is Harold Jenkins. I'm a retired science teacher over at McCallum High. The voice on the other end sounded hesitant, slightly trembling. I was reading the American Statesman this morning. About the bodies you boys found out near the lake. What about them, Mr. Jenkins? Miller asked, signaling for Harris to grab a pen. Well, the paper said you think the murders might have been happening over the last year. It got me thinking about something I saw back in July. I'm an amateur ornithologist, you see.
Bird watching.
I was up on a limestone ridge near Lago Vista, tracking a golden-cheeked warbler.
Very rare bird.
Miller suppressed a sigh. The tip, Mr. Jenkins.
Please. Right.
Well, I was looking down into the valley, near an old, abandoned cabin. Suddenly, I heard a terrible commotion, and a truck came tearing out of the brush, driving like a bat out of hell down a private logging road. It scared all the wildlife half to death. I watched it through my binoculars. Miller sat up straight, the exhaustion suddenly vanishing from his bones. Can you describe the vehicle, Harold?
Oh, absolutely.
I have a near photographic memory for details, the old man said proudly. It was a bright yellow pickup truck.
A Ford F-150.
Late 70s model, I'd say 1978 or 79. But the most distinct thing about it was the rear bumper. The left side was deeply dented, right down to the chrome, like it had backed into a sturdy oak tree. Miller's heart hammered against his ribs. He wrote furiously on his legal pad, yellow Ford F-150.
Late 70s. Dented left rear bumper.
In 1986, trying to track down a specific truck registration across Texas without a computerized database was a monumental task. It meant sending physical requests to the Department of Public Safety and waiting days, sometimes weeks, for clerks to manually sift through paper files. But combined with the real estate angle, it was a laser-focused beam of light in a pitch-black room. Mr. Jenkins, Miller said, his voice deadly serious. You might have just broken this case wide open. I need you to come down to the station this afternoon to give an official statement. Miller hung up the phone and looked at Eris, a predatory gleam in his tired eyes. The ghost finally had a shape. Change of plans, Eris, Miller commanded, ripping the top sheet off his legal pad. We aren't just looking for any real estate agent. I want you to contact the DPS. We need a list of every registered late 70s Ford F-150 in Travis and Williamson counties. Then, we cross-reference that list with anyone holding a state appraisal or real estate license. Our killer drives a yellow truck.
The web was cast.
The Austin police were no longer grasping at shadows in the woods. They were hunting, and the circle was about to close around a quiet, unremarkable woman who thought she was invincible. November 1986. In the modern era, cross-referencing a vehicle registration with occupational licenses would take a detective a few keystrokes and perhaps 30 seconds of waiting for a progress bar to fill. But in the autumn of 1986, Detective Ray Miller and his partner, David Eris, lived in a world of suffocating paperwork, manual labor, and blindingly slow bureaucracy. For 3 agonizing weeks, the Homicide Division became a graveyard of greenbar, dot matrix printer paper. The Texas Department of Public Safety had finally delivered the requested records, a staggering list of every late 70s Ford F-150 registered in Travis, Williamson, and Hayes counties. Over 400 trucks matched the color yellow. Eris spent his days and nights hunched over a battered metal desk, his fingers stained black from cheap newspaper ink and carbon copies, manually comparing the DPS truck list with a registry of licensed real estate agents, brokers, and certified property appraisers provided by the state board. On a rainy Tuesday afternoon, Eris finally slammed his coffee mug down on the desk, the ceramic clattering loudly against the metal.
Miller.
I've got it. I've narrowed the Venn diagram. Miller, nursing a migraine and a stale Winston, walked over. Eris pointed a nicotine-stained finger at a highlighted row on the printout. 12 yellow trucks owned by real estate professionals in the greater Austin area, Eris explained, his voice vibrating with exhausted excitement.
8 are men, 4 are women.
I started pulling the specific property records for the missing men. Arthur Pendleton's Dallas firm hired an Austin-based company to appraise that farm in Dripping Springs. Richard Howell used the same company for his bankrupt ranch.
Which company?
Miller asked, leaning in close. Lone Star Property Appraisals, Eris tapped the paper. And take a look at their senior field appraiser.
A woman named Clara Vance.
38 years old.
Unmarried. Lives in South Austin.
And according to the DPS, she registers a bright yellow 1978 Ford F-150. Miller, she was officially assigned to both the Pendleton and Howell properties on the exact weeks they fell off the map. Miller stared at the name. A female serial killer using blunt force trauma was a statistical anomaly, a rarity that defied almost every profile the FBI behavioral science guys in Quantico were writing. But the paper trail was undeniable.
Grab your coat, Eris.
We're going to pay Miss Vance a visit. An hour later, the 2 detectives walked into the heavily air-conditioned, wood-paneled office of Lone Star Property Appraisals on Congress Avenue. The loud, rhythmic clatter of an IBM Selectric typewriter stopped the moment they flashed their gold shields to the receptionist. When they were pointed toward Clara's desk, Miller felt a sudden jolt of cognitive dissonance. He had been hunting a phantom, a brutal monster capable of crushing skulls and dragging heavy corpses through thick Texas mud. The woman sitting before him was barely 5 feet 4 inches tall. She wore a modest, high-collared white blouse and a beige cardigan, her brown hair pinned back in an austere, librarian-style bun. She looked entirely harmless.
She looked invisible. Miss Vance?
Miller asked, removing his tan Stetson. I'm Detective Miller, this is Detective Eris. We're with the Austin Police Department. We'd like to ask you a few questions about some properties you appraised last year. Clara offered a polite, practiced smile. There was no hesitation, no widening of the eyes.
Of course, detectives.
How can I help the police? We're investigating the disappearances of Arthur Pendleton and Richard Howell, Miller said, pulling out his notebook. He watched her face closely. Most people, even innocent ones, exhibited a spike in heart rate or a nervous flutter of the hands when police mentioned missing persons. Clara simply folded her hands neatly on her desk. Is that so? Miller pressed, leaning his weight onto the edge of her metal desk, deliberately invading her space to test her nerves. You drive a yellow Ford truck, Miss Vance.
A 78.
I do, Clara nodded, her gaze meeting Miller's directly. It's excellent for hauling my equipment. The hill country roads are quite rough on standard sedans. In July of this year, a witness saw a truck matching yours speeding away from a private road near Lago Vista. It had a deeply dented left rear bumper, Miller said, his eyes locking onto hers. He was playing a dangerous hand. They hadn't found a body in Lago Vista, but a quick check that morning revealed the property owner there, a Thomas Bannister, had been reported missing by his sister in August. For a fraction of a second, the polite mask slipped. A microscopic tightening of her jaw. A slight stillness in her breathing. Then, the mask seamlessly reattached itself. I did an appraisal in Lago Vista in July. The Bannister cabin, Clara answered smoothly. I accidentally backed into a low limestone retaining wall at a grocery store the day prior, which explains the dented bumper. I was in a rush to leave the property because a severe thunderstorm was rolling in over the lake. I never even saw the owner. Is there a problem, detective? Eris looked at Miller, silently communicating that her story was perfectly plausible, perfectly mundane. But Miller wasn't looking at the facts anymore, he was looking at her hands. They were resting on her desk. They were perfectly, chillingly still. There wasn't a single tremor. It was the unnatural stillness of a predator waiting in the grass. No problem at all, Miss Vance. Thank you for your time, Miller said, standing up and handing her his card. If you remember anything else, give us a call. As they walked out into the blinding Texas afternoon, Eris exhaled loudly. Well, that was a bust. She's 5'0", Miller. There's no way she dragged a 200-pound linebacker like Bannister into the brush. Miller lit a Winston, the flame of his lighter trembling slightly in the wind. She's lying, Eris. How do you know? Her alibi was rock solid. The dent, the storm, the dates. It all tracks. Because when I mentioned dead men and missing people, she didn't check her pulse, she didn't sweat, and she didn't break eye contact, Miller said, staring through the glass doors at the unassuming woman returning to her typewriter.
She's made of absolute ice. Call the captain.
I want a 24-hour unmarked tail put on her truck. She knows we're looking now. And a cornered animal always makes a mistake. A biting November cold front had swept through South Austin, stripping the pecan trees of their leaves and turning the night air sharp and brittle. Across the street from Clara Vance's modest, single-story house, an unmarked dark blue 1982 Plymouth Fury sat idling in the shadows. Inside, Detectives Miller and Eris were running on pure adrenaline, stale coffee, and a dashboard heater that barely worked. For 3 agonizing days, they had watched the ghost. Clara's routine was maddeningly boring. She left for the appraisal office at 7:30 a.m., returned at 5:15 p.m., watered her dead-looking hydrangeas, and turned off her living room lights precisely at 9 p.m. She didn't have visitors. She didn't make late-night phone calls. To anyone else, she was a lonely spinster living a quiet, unremarkable life. But Miller knew better. He knew his visit to her office had rattled the cage. And on the 4th night, at 2 a.m., the cage finally cracked. Miller, wake up, Eris whispered hoarsely, elbowing his partner. Look at the garage. Miller rubbed his bloodshot eyes and grabbed his heavy binoculars. The side door of Clara's detached garage was open, spilling a weak, yellow shaft of light into the dark backyard. Clara stepped out into the freezing air. She wasn't wearing her neat beige cardigan or a pleated skirt. She was wearing heavy denim overalls and thick rubber gloves. In her hands, she carried a rusted metal burn barrel and a plastic jug. Through the magnified lenses, Miller watched her strike a long wooden match. The barrel erupted into flames, the sharp, chemical smell of lighter fluid drifting across the quiet suburban street. "She's burning something," Eris said, leaning forward.
Papers.
"No. Fabric," Miller replied, his heart hammering a heavy rhythm against his ribs. Clara was tossing items into the fire. Through the binoculars, Miller caught a glimpse of a shredded white blouse, the one she had worn the day she fought Thomas Bannister in the dirt, before the flames consumed it.
But she wasn't done.
Clara walked over to her bright yellow 1978 F-150 parked in the driveway. She opened the heavy tailgate and began scrubbing the metal bed with frantic, desperate energy, pouring raw bleach directly onto the steel. The pungent, stinging odor of chlorine mixed with the thick black smoke from the burn barrel.
"That's it.
"That's our probable cause," Miller said, his voice hard. "She's destroying physical evidence. She's panicking. I'm going to the payphone at the Exxon station down the block to wake up Judge Harrison. We need a search warrant for that house and that truck right now. You keep your eyes glued to her, Eris. If she tries to drive off, you take her down." By 8 a.m. the next morning, the trap was set. Miller didn't want to arrest Clara at her home. A cornered killer with a home field advantage was a recipe for dead cops. They waited until she followed her rigid, compulsive routine. She drove to work, blissfully unaware of the unmarked squad cars tailing her blind spots. The moment Clara sat down at her metal desk at Lone Star Property Appraisals and rolled a fresh sheet of paper into her IBM Selectric typewriter, the glass doors of the office swung open. Miller and Eris walked in, accompanied by two uniformed APD officers. The loud chatter of the office instantly died. Mr. Davis, the red-faced boss, dropped his coffee mug. It shattered on the linoleum, a loud, sharp crack that echoed in the silent room. Clara looked up. For the very first time, the mask shattered completely. The polite, invisible spinster vanished, replaced by a pair of cold, dark, terrifyingly empty eyes.
She didn't reach for her purse. She didn't scream.
She simply stared at Miller, realizing she had finally been outmaneuvered. "Clara Vance," Miller said, his voice echoing in the dead silence of the office as he stepped up to her desk. "You are under arrest for the murders of Arthur Pendleton, Mark Evans, and Richard Howell. You have the right to remain silent." Eris stepped behind her, pulling her arms back. The heavy steel handcuffs clicked loudly around her thin wrists. The sound was final. "I don't understand," Mr. Davis stammered, his face pale with shock.
"Clara? Murder?"
"There must be some mistake. She's our best appraiser." Miller looked at the terrified boss, then down at the petite, silent woman in cuffs. "She's good at her job, Mr. Davis. She just has a very specific way of evaluating the dirt. Eris, read her the rest of her rights and get her in the car. I've got a search team waiting at her house." As they marched Clara out of the building into the glaring morning sun, she kept her head high. She didn't shed a single tear. But the reign of the ghost of Travis County was officially over. By noon, Clara Vance's perfectly manicured lawn in South Austin was completely trampled under the heavy boots of the Austin Police Department's crime scene unit. Yellow tape cordoned off the property. Neighbors stood on their porches in hushed, terrified clusters, watching as the quiet spinster's life was systematically dismantled by men in heavy jackets. Detective Ray Miller stood in the center of Clara's pristine living room. The house smelled faintly of lavender and old paper. It was agonizingly normal. There were no macabre paintings, no disturbing literature, no signs of a deranged mind. But Miller knew that true monsters rarely advertise their nature on the walls. They bury it deep. "Start with the truck," Miller instructed the lead forensic technician, a meticulous man named Barnes. "She poured raw bleach in the bed last night, but she was rushing in the dark.
Tear it apart.
Check every seam, every bolt, every crevice. Blood doesn't just disappear." Barnes and his team pushed the yellow 1978 F-150 into the detached garage and covered the windows with black tarps to block out the midday sun. They sprayed the metal bed and the tailgate with luminol, a chemical compound used by police for decades to detect trace amounts of iron found in hemoglobin. When they turned off the overhead lights, the bed of the truck lit up with a faint, ghostly blue luminescence. Clara had scrubbed the flat surfaces clean, but the blood of Thomas Bannister had seeped deep into the rusted seams of the tailgate and the hinges. "We've got a reaction, Detective," Barnes called out from the dark garage. "And we found something else wrapped in an oily rag beneath the driver's bench seat. A solid steel tire iron. It's been washed, but there are microscopic dark flakes crusted in the knurled grip. Looks like dried blood and bone fragments. We'll get it to the lab to type the blood, but I'd bet my pension it's human. Miller nodded grimly.
Good work.
Now let's tear this house down to the studs. Inside, Miller and Detective Eris took the master bedroom. They emptied dresser drawers, patted down winter coats, and searched beneath the mattress. It was Eris who noticed the slight unevenness of the floor. Near the back corner of the small walk-in closet, a single oak floorboard sat just a fraction of an inch higher than the rest. Eris wedged his pocket knife into the crack and pried the board up. Beneath it sat a small, gray, fireproof metal lockbox. Miller, Eris said, his breath hitching. Got something. Using a heavy set of bolt cutters from the forensics kit, Miller snapped the cheap padlock. He opened the heavy lid. Inside, resting on a bed of folded velvet, was a silver Zippo lighter with the initials Emmy engraved on the side, and a gold Timex wristwatch with a cracked leather band. Mark Evans and Richard Howell, Miller whispered, staring at the trophies. The physical receipts of her kills.
She kept them.
Wives and girlfriends can identify these on the stand. That's the rope for her neck right there. But the most damning piece of evidence was beneath the jewelry. It was a thick, leather-bound portfolio containing heavily annotated topographical maps of Travis County. Miller spread the maps out on Clara's neatly made bed. They were official county appraisal maps, detailing property lines, elevation changes, and soil compositions. But Clara had added her own notations. Using a red felt tip pen, she had drawn small, precise X marks in the deep wooded areas. Miller's finger traced the map near Lake Travis.
Look here. 3 red marks.
These correspond exactly to the coordinates where the hikers found Arthur Pendleton, and where we dug up Evans and Howell. He flipped the page to the Lago Vista region, scanning the rugged terrain near the Bannister cabin. And there it is. A 4th red X, completely isolated in the brush, about a mile from the property line. She wasn't just hiding bodies, Eris.
She was cataloging them.
Like a surveyor marking property stakes. Eris stared at the map, the color draining from his face.
She's a machine, Miller.
Cold, calculated, and perfectly organized. Grab a shovel, Eris, Miller said, rolling up the map and tucking it under his arm. The exhaustion of the past month had completely vanished, replaced by the grim satisfaction of a completed hunt. We have a date with the dirt. It's time to bring Thomas Bannister home. The Travis County Courthouse in May 1987 was a sweltering, claustrophobic arena. The trial of Clara Vance had become a morbid spectacle, drawing reporters from across the state who were fascinated by the glaring contradiction between the killer's brutal crimes and her unassuming, librarian-like appearance. Clara sat at the defense table in a tailored beige skirt suit, her posture perfect, her expression an impenetrable mask of polite indifference. She looked like a woman waiting patiently for a delayed bus, not a serial murderer fighting for her life. The prosecution, led by a fiery district attorney named Robert Hayes, systematically dismantled her facade piece by piece. Hayes didn't rely on theatrical psychological profiling, he relied on the irrefutable, crushing weight of physical evidence. He paced before the jury box, holding up thick plastic evidence bags. The defense wants you to believe Miss Vance is a delicate victim of circumstance, Hayes thundered, his voice echoing off the high cedar ceilings. He held up a bagged silver Zippo and a gold Timex. Tell that to the grieving families of Mark Evans and Richard Howell, whose personal effects were found locked in a fireproof box beneath the defendant's bedroom floor. Clara's defense attorney, a sweating public defender, looked utterly defeated. He had tried to argue self-defense, but the sheer volume of the bodies and the calculated concealment made it a near impossible task. Hayes then brought out the final, devastating piece of the puzzle. It wasn't the blood in the yellow Ford F-150, nor the heavily annotated map that had led police straight to Thomas Bannister's shallow grave in Lago Vista. It was a small, delicate object in a clear bag. When Detective Miller and his team excavated the site in Lago Vista, they sifted through the dirt where Miss Vance had violently struggled with Thomas Bannister, Hayes said, his voice dropping to a dramatic hush. They found this. A vintage silver cameo brooch. We have sworn testimony from 7 of Miss Vance's co-workers at Lone Star Property Appraisals who confirm she wore this exact family heirloom every single day. The clasp was broken. It was torn from her collar as she bludgeoned a man to death. When the jury foreman read the verdict a week later, there was no gasp from the gallery. It was an inevitability. Guilty of capital murder on all counts. The judge, staring down at Clara with a mixture of disgust and bewilderment, didn't hesitate during the penalty phase. He sentenced her to death by lethal injection. Clara simply nodded, her eyes empty, and allowed the bailiffs to lead her away in heavy iron chains. 15 years later. November 2002. The endless cycle of state and federal appeals had finally dried up. The criminal justice system in Texas was notoriously slow, but it was relentless. Clara Vance was now 53 years old. Her brown hair had turned a stark, brittle white, and the deep lines on her face betrayed the heavy toll of a decade and a half spent in solitary confinement at the Mountain View unit in Gatesville. On the evening of her execution, she was transferred to the Huntsville unit, the grim brick fortress that housed the Texas execution chamber. The humid air of the hill country felt like a distant, faded dream. She sat in a small, sterile holding cell just steps away from the death chamber, refusing her final meal, opting only for a single cup of black coffee.
At 6 p.m., the heavy steel door opened.
The warden, accompanied by a chaplain and 2 guards, read the final death warrant. Clara didn't speak. She was escorted into the bright, clinical execution room and strapped tightly to the heavy gurney with thick leather belts. Her arms were extended on the armrests. Behind the thick viewing glass, she could see the faces of the victims' families, their eyes burning with a complex mix of grief and closure. Standing quietly in the back of the viewing room was a much older gray-haired Ray Miller, now a retired captain, watching the ghost he had hunted finally meet her end. The executioner, hidden behind a one-way mirror, began the sequence. The saline drip was replaced by the lethal cocktail, sodium thiopental to induce a deep coma, pancuronium bromide to paralyze the muscles and halt breathing, and finally, potassium chloride to stop the heart. Clara looked up at the sterile fluorescent lights on the ceiling. There was no fear in her eyes, only a cold, mechanical acceptance. The heavy, blinding rage that had sparked in an abandoned farmhouse 17 years ago had completely burned out, leaving nothing but cold ash. She took one last, shallow breath as the drugs flooded her veins. Her eyes slid shut. A minute later, the heart monitor flattened into a continuous, high-pitched tone. The warden checked his watch and stepped up to the microphone. Time of death, 6:14 p.m. The woods of Lake Travis were finally quiet. Thank you for listening to the chilling tale of Clara Vance. If you want to dive into more fascinating stories and dark mysteries, make sure to subscribe.
Until next time, stay safe.